Hello, my name is Jake Riley, and this is another walkthrough of my Quake map that I've been developing called Hateforge Manor. This is the first encounter of the level, in which the player walks through the door into the dining room and they find the swarmer enemy on the opposite end of a wall. What I wanted to do with that encounter in particular was to introduce the swarmer enemy in a way that was a bit more creative. Since I ran into this problem with when the player walked through the door and the dog enemy was on the opposite side, they would just funnel it through the door into the other room, and killing it with no difficulty. So I decided to add a little bit of an element of surprise, in which they open the door and trigger the secret door that was in the wall. The encounter in the dining room effectively sets the tone for the rest of the map, as there are other enemies that are hidden from the player's view as they come into rooms, such as the ogre for the kitchen. The kitchen's combat encounter was meant to give the player another weapon and a large enemy to test it on, also to simultaneously introduce the heavy enemy that they will be encountering throughout the level. One of my personal favorite parts of this. If the player gets dropped in here with enough ammo in their super nail gun, this gives them enough time to test that out against all of those swarmer enemies that you saw right there. One of the things that I really enjoyed about making that was the process of figuring out how once triggers worked. In testing this particular section of the level, something that I realized was that when I had the trigger and the key on opposite platforms, that the key could have just been gotten to by the player if they just jumped over it. So I decided to change the location of the key to be directly over the trapdoor, as opposed to being across from it. After the player gets the key to from the freezer, they can then enter the ballroom across the hall. The ballroom encounter is where I introduce the melee enemies. In introducing the knights to the player, I took the same approach that I did with the swarmer enemy for the dogs. I wanted to make sure that they were out of sight and out of mind until the player got in the room. As a result, that's why there's that wall over there, and the other knight can't be seen because he's hidden behind the piano. In this particular area, the knight's actually the default enemy that appears. The only reason that the ogre appeared in that hallway was because the player picked up the key from the previous room. This is one of the coolest encounters that I've designed so far, in which, after the player picks up that key, a wizard and 2 dogs will spawn in, and there are 3 knights in there by default, all of them obscured by these bookshelves. The player runs around and kills all the enemies in whatever order they wish, and if they happen to pick up the key by accident, it will make the encounter more chaotic. Something that I wanted to mention for that particular section was that there was a secret that I had implemented in that room. The issue, though, was that the secret, since it was inside of the in-combat space, it interfered with the player's pathing and made the encounter more difficult because the player could get stuck on it. As a result, I removed the secret and just put the goodie in the room itself. There is another combat encounter that is tied to that room. It's just through this secret passageway that I put in the wall by pushing this button. This secret passageway allowed the person who originally owned the manor to pass through undetected. To reward the players who did find this, I put some health, some ammo, and some armor in there, as well as an enemy that was obscured behind the hidden door. The hidden passageway through the freezer also allows the player to backtrack, and if they happen to figure out that the button was what allowed them to get through, then they would be more inclined to push the button on the opposite side of the freezer door that opens the secret in the kitchen. To imply to the player that this is getting a bit more difficult, I put an ogre again in the second to last room. The ogre is also guarding a super shotgun that's on the bed and some ammo in the room. Once the player acquires the key from the room, it's time for them to enter the undercroft. Something that I learned from my feedback when I was designing this one was that the columns wouldn't exactly be enough cover for the space. I also noticed that I made the space a bit too big for it to warrant having just columns as pieces of cover. So I implemented these walls in order for the player to hide behind and fight the enemies from, as well as a second level with some goodies for them to get. Once the player defeats all 6 enemies, the doorway opens and they are allowed to exit the level. Thank you for watching.